Welcome to the fourth installment of the MUD Parcel Reading Series for 2022. The MUD Parcel Series is a companion to the MUD Proposal online journal and archive, which is currently on its 7th edition. So the MUD is annually updated, and it features poets and projects that are international in scope and multidisciplinary in focus. I'm Pat Clifford. I'm a poet and social worker and the producer of the series. And my co-editor, Aryanil Mukherjee, is here as our host and discussant. So we're very pleased today to be joined by Peter Boyle. He's joining us from near Sydney, Australia. Peter's recent work includes What the Painter Saw in Our Faces, 2001, Apocrypha of William O'Shaughnessy, 2009, Towns in the Great Desert, which is new and selected poems, 2013, and Ghost Speaking, 2016. He won the 2020 Kenneth Slessor Poetry Prize for his book Enfolded in the Wings of a Great Darkness, 2019. And then we'll also hear for some recent work, including Notes Towards a Dream Book of Endings in 2021 and Ideas of Travel, 2022. Boyle, he's also translated French and Spanish poets, including Federico Garcia Lorca and César Vallejo and Jose Coser. So welcome, Peter.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Thank you, Aryanil. Okay, I'll start with a poem from quite a while back from the 2013 book, Towns in the Great Desert, a poem about a very misguided tree, the tree's ambition. A tree with the deep ambition of becoming an ant, long evenings in night school, first attempts at rapid movement, countless resets of thinking like a team, business studies 5071. One day the tree realizes becoming an ant requires the perfection of smallness. The tree would start by concentrating its being in a single leaf, a dry leaf preferably, scored with old wounds. Next, it would work on narrowing its lifespan, ideally to no more than a few intense hours. The tree thinks living like an ant means living inside death. So much industry, endless conferences on collaboration, decisions taken in microseconds, death as a name for a species, a destiny. Here, inside its bark, watching a tribe of ants, unable to join their purposive non-stop rush hour. The sadness of being a tree. Its branches fall back around it like a song of defeat. Farewell, boys, comrades of my dreams. I must sleep with my silence. Always trying to mouth the one green syllable, condemned to the dunce's chair. Me and my eternal shadow, my inability to organize a planet. And a bit of a change of tone here to a love poem from a long way back. In the small hours. It's 3 a.m. in the morning of a day you won't enter for so many hours. Where you are, yesterday's sunlight still bathes your feet as you walk. And tonight, hearing your voice, I worried that one day I'll lose my images of all those I love. Outside, the city's still restless. Taxis alert and shiny as golden birds, waiting for the crumbs of dawn. At 55, I know so little how to live. In cafes across this city, lovers still hold hands and cups balance on the edges of tables. Darkness falls around me like soft snow. Beside the narrow bed, my nightlight is staring right into me. I will hold your voice inside me as long as I can. When I sleep, you'll go on walking through a steady explosion of white flowers. And now 2 poems from Notes Towards the Dream Book of Ending. Crowded out. The world presses in, a towering river of debris glittering with specks of one ongoing explosion. All of us are morphing. our faces layered with many faces, two eyes gazing upward from the ending of time. Our skin is traveling from country to country, even as we sit still and the second hand stays frozen on the wall clock. From somewhere far inside us, a young woman from a millennium ago rises to the surface, comes close, and we shiver with all her tenderness. At the place where our breath is suddenly held back, the child is there, watching the trees above him spin in fast motion. In the vast empty barroom of the mind, a skeleton holding a wine glass gives us a familiar nod. Birds fly in and out of the multiple cages that are our rib cage. A single cry from any one of their throats is enough to thread white light across the darkness. So large, so impossible, our hands shake as we carry the world. A very short poem now. The Coming Tree. The lost world is there again before me in this small corridor of stars. Pluck one and open, fold down at every corner, and watch the butterfly of ash wriggle free from its glittering origami casket. Is it summer in the leaves of where you are? Write to me often. Tell me of how the under-earth is treating you. I've written 2 books of heteronymous poems by imagined invented poets, which I supposedly translate. Apocrypha 2009 gathers poets, philosophers, invented people from the ancient world. Here are 2 poems by the Byzantine poet Aryanil. When all that dreadful predictability comes trudging up from the depths of the universe, pleading, say me, give voice to my long life. How beautiful to hear the water drop and its great tumble from the broken gutter to the wooden floor. What lies below us, what lies above us, suddenly the one sky. There are words, we don't know what they are, and summers we don't know if we'll get there, and doorways left open into bright courtyards, and an arrangement that looks like life, though the water is rising past our ankles. Through all the 13 tiers of the serried hillside, sleep, we can't find you. The distances are what they are, magical. Ghost Speaking gathers 11 imagined, invented poets from Latin America, France and Spain. Here's a poem by Antonio Almeida. Thoughts in a cafe. Day and world on a road that leads beyond. I pass them by, and it's good to know sparks left behind have lodged in the leaves of the Chinaberry tree I saw in a photograph of a Cuban sidewalk circa 1912. Nothing is lost. Sitting beside a mirror that runs the whole length of this cafe, I wait at the very edge of a double life. Every person, every table, cup and plate persists in its glassy being. And the tree outside, the buildings of the street swim towards me, ignorant of death. Men and women lean into each other, stand or drift. The stillness of a Sunday without end muffles their voices. We have all the time of that unmoving cloud resting above the shoulder of the young girl with her faraway smile and long, long ponytail. My eyes lift to see your face on the threshold of the corridor that descends, goes on descending through the mind's still center. Gone, gone, utterly gone. A poem by Ernesto Rey, Eleutheria. Water spirit of small bowls, beyond the bamboo curtain of my window, a black bowl harboring green shoots I have no name for. Maybe the small slick of water on the surface is enough for you. Maybe the few early morning raindrops are enough for you. an ornamental tree spreading fan-like branches, 2 small stone steps into a garden, with room only for a few well-tended weeds, if everything non-native is a weed. Sun, water, a few flourishes of stone. I would have liked an ocean, a tidal inlet, a riverbed at least, or clear creek, cut like childhood between suburban allotments. But where you glide is my renewal, telling me a cup will do, a line of silver in air to swim and glide and curl up within a water drop, in the tracery of moisture at the end of a leaf, what this morning the birds harvest in the long silence of the skies. Ricardo Javier Bisogno, born in Argentina, escapes to Brazil, then Spain, Mexico. And I write, he's of course invented, and I write, he writes a poem, Threads, which are in long, thin threads. I'll read the last 2 of these. Between each breath, the mind descends, the blurred pain all over me, fine nails brushing fire against the shell that holds me. I enter the mill wheel and clock house of the benevolent spiders. From far off, I hear voices, tides of anger about to break over me. A child before my father's downtown office door, the silver gleam of its surface, where, trapped forever, I see my awkwardness. This body I couldn't own or give back. Or in the spider's inner clock house, I see myself, aged 22, walking off the bridge into Brazil, free and alive, a clean slate for the decades to inscribe. All the wild colours pouring through the third eye, in this stilled space between 2 breaths, a nowhere bubble, bearing all my life, crests of calm, this emptying out, this momentary ghost becoming. A nowhere beacon flares behind barred windows, glow of 2 bodies on rainy season nights, a simple trust that flares beyond the world, bright tram cars on steep streets, bells of vendors' carts beside a church's small side entrance, poised woman strolling on evenings when a storm has almost come, bright flutter of kites above a line of housetops, avenues that open to the sea, bougainvillea blossoms, bangled wrists and ankles shimmering their music, scents of fried bananas and dried fish, narrow doorways, children huddling while a great rain passes. I hold fast to what is. And now I'll move on to a few poems from the latest book, Ideas of Travel. This is 140 poems, a poem sequence, just they're numbered poems and no titles. Teardrops laid out on bare earth, an offering to the spirits of the place. No 2 teardrops are the same, you tell me. And on this smoothed out patch of earth, only teardrops grow. If we were wiser, we would have words for everything. For this line a faltering hand shakes in the soil. For this mark where 1 foot has sunk deeper than the other. A word for the precise midwinter cold rising from the earth to pass layer by layer into the hollow space at the center of breathing. And there would be a separate word for each star we see above us when all the lights of the planet go out. We would empty ourselves into the purity of an endless litany, welcoming each being one by one, and around us, catching their true names, the dead would gaze calmly back at us from inside their other life. At this hour, shirts make their way off clotheslines and huddle in windows. Between the rows of freshly planted shrubs, the dead have given up on resurrection. From now on, they will speak only from inside us, whispering scrambled incantations from their manuals of grief and love, trying to mend the broken universal translation machine that ferries us across time. This next poem is about my late partner who passed away in 2018 from cancer. The star that replaced her left eye was a door to a distant corridor. You walk there in the evening, and she is quietly cleaning dishes and adjusting the cups from which small winged insects sip tinctures of lemon balm and white bruised hailstones. Through her left eye, she guides you hand in hand to where waterfalls stop and space takes over. We belong there together, she says, gesturing at the stillness of light cascading through light. In the starless realm where dreams split open, only the frozen night dew cradles your head. All down your left side, the shivering wakes you to the raw, dangling non sequitur of life without her. And I'll move on now to some poems from the book that I wrote during the last year and a half of her life. It's called Enfolded in the Wings of a Great Darkness. It's a single book-length poem. It's in fragments, and I'll read a few of these. If light, the sun's light, its bright, dependable presence among us, moving into our rooms, brushing our bodies as we wake, altering nothing, so it seems, yet subtly changing everything, arriving and retreating beyond all interventions, indefinably here, is the closest we will ever have to a metaphor for being dead. Vanished from so far off, we will glow among our objects and our traces, unspoken, irreplaceable, the underworld's almost indetectable shimmer. As if each breath might be a separate life, each with its own window of fine glass, a house, a garden with a tree, a fountain, a bird bath tilted at an odd angle among a small flock of white and black birds. To be there as my lover sleeps and count her breaths, each one suddenly infinite, a loop outside of time. Down the side path of the house, in a proliferating parallel universe, the hydrangeas of the dead woman emit their light for some time yet. For some time yet, the light over her shoulder falls across a wind-stilled pattern in water that looks like a long procession of doors we could almost touch and pass through, a circling stream of faces. Like a tree rooted in the earth that outlives us, how its branches lean towards us in the slight 3 p.m. breeze. The way a young woman dips one foot in water and holds her whole body suspended from the other. And the corridors of water opening before her shine as if she were weightless. Is it the light that emanates from the dead? All this we have no name for. Above the empty asphalt car park, you climb up the steep, narrow stairs towards the narrow door, propped against some makeshift cathedral, a wooden shelf of the sky. At each rung of the ladder, how much smaller you grow, barely 2 arms waving from a sack of dark linen, there to enter the unknown, whatever it will be, whatever it once was, whoever you are at that moment. 8 or 9 words fall on a page slowly, blood drops or stars of a remote heaven, 8 or 9 markers of a sentence, torn out of the white wind, the everyday shuffle of time. The daylight goes, in one phrase, empty. Out there towards the exploding edges, the back and forth dialogue of the blood, bone cages the breath makes its way between. This voice isn't us. It isn't not us. It is through us. In harrowing circles, vast wheels spin towards us. At the whirlwind's still center, cosmos fragments glitter. Ourselves stripped bare, enfolded in the wings of a great darkness. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Peter. That's quite a impactful and engaging reading. And sorry to hear about the passing of your partner, but the writing is just so, I don't know how to say it, inspiring or impactful. And just makes me curious to hear more. And you have just a lot of questions. To me, it's like the reading like took you to the most intimate of spaces, but also was very free and expansive, both in terms of culture, time, place. So, again, looking forward to this conversation. Aryanil, do you want to kick us off with the question?
Yeah, I agree with Pat. Peter, a couple of days back, Pat and myself, we were discussing your poems. And for me, I picked two phrases from the samples that you read. And I shared those expressions with Pat, saying that, if I had to sum up Peter Boyle's, the nature of Peter Boyle's poetry, I would use these two expressions from his poems. One was a steady explosion of white flowers, and the other was that our hands shake as we carry the world. So there is I notice, there is an essential softness in your work, and most likely it is part of you, and it shows up in your work. So that really appealed to me. And the poem about loss. So initially, I kept wondering. I made some notes. I'll read them out to you. I'll get to the first poems. I have some notes on the tree's ambition from Apocrypha and Crowded Out in the Small Hours. But first, let me get to ideas of travel. So, as I was reading the poem, I felt initially that one's heaviest investment is to find the locus of these travels. What are really these travels about? Do the ideas of travel lie in these many imperceptible movements that are basically part of the drudgeries of everyday life? And then, I kept I kept gazing and gaping at these movements. And then I began to think that maybe this is about a certain immobility, actually, these so-called movements. And then when I got towards the end, I realized that it is actually a poem about loss, the loss of a loved one. And Pat just said that. It's really beautiful. It made me think of another great poem, book-length poem, by Jacques Roubaud. It's called Something Black.
Yeah. I've met Jacques Roubaud briefly, very briefly, when he was in Sydney, and I know that book. Yeah.
Okay. He's still alive. He's probably 90 or something. But
yeah,
he's still.
He was part of Oulipo.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So would you like to talk about that poem first, and then we will go back to the other ones?
Well, Ideas of Travel overall, there's 140 poems. They were largely written during lockdown. Sydney had a very long period of isolation. So in a sense, that's ironic. But the part of the main travel within them is the travel across my life. So there are poems in there that are memories of my time in hospital as a small child. And there's also poems of one about my father, one about my mother, one about my late partner, or a couple about my late partner. But there's also a lot about the living and the dead, and the sense of a journey across life. But also a lot of immobility and engaging with things that are, we had a very severe lockdown where you could really only stay in your house or go for a walk once a day by a nearby place out in the open, which I did by the river. So it was a time when you do become very inward, and also you become very aware of the small things in your environment, the trees in the backyard and so on. But the same happened in a way with Enfolded in the Wings of a Great Darkness, which I wrote while Debbie was alive. Debbie was reading them. She's an anthropologist and a writer herself. Her last book, interestingly, was called Shimmer. It's about the life of flying foxes, and it's about the glitter or glimmer of life and the passing on of life. So it was a book of poetry that I shared with her. It was largely written out of dreams and images, and not very much directly, in a sense, directly about the experiences of going to hospital. But even there, a line like 8 or 9 markers of a sentence, blood drops. It's about the way, not only is it about language, sentence, but it's also, you know, a sentence like cancer, which is detected in blood drops. Yeah.
That's really moving. It is a very organic poem. You can feel it from the beginning. So I did think of immobility, which you just mentioned. I didn't know this was written during the lockdown.
Yeah. And also another factor is that I had polio when I was 3, and I'm still, my right leg's still paralyzed, and I had a lot of periods in hospital. So unlike most people, I've had to learn to walk something like 3 or 4 times over in my life.
I see. Okay.
And in a sense, immobility is one of my first memories in life.
Right.
Experience of being paralyzed.
Okay. So let's go back to the very first poem, The Tree's Ambition. So there, you know, I'll just share, you know, because neither of us are really academic scholars or professors of poetry. So we read like an average reader. And so I'll just share my my thoughts on it. So one question I had about The Tree's Ambition is, you know, do you remember the time and space where, when you wrote this, when and where you wrote this poem?
Okay, well, very curiously, this is one of the very few poems that I wrote originally in Spanish. I did a rough draft very rapidly of it in Spanish.
Okay.
And so at a certain point, it brought out humor, and it led me into a different space. So originally, you know, comrades of my dreams is compañeros y compañeras de mis sueños. So it was kind of almost like a takeoff of Neruda. Sort of humorous freeing up of the self that goes on when I write in another language, which I've only done, I think, once in French and once in Spanish. But I do sometimes, when I'm journaling, write in another language to try to get around mental blockage and see things differently.
Right. That's something I was discussing with Pat a couple of days back. I know from your interactions with Corsair, and I see you often post in Spanish. I know a little bit of Spanish, not great, but I have some working knowledge of Spanish. And from that I can realize how fluent you are. But I kind of guess that you might be also fluent in French. And
well,
so
my spoken French and my reading French is actually better than my reading Spanish.
Oh, I see. Wow.
But you know, there's so many great untranslated poets in Spanish.
Yes,
it's huge, and I've been drawn to that language in a deeper way, really, than French. But René Char I really love, and I've translated some of his poems, and a few other French poets.
Right.
But I wouldn't call myself fluent in either language. It's a real battle, and in a way, both of them, my language is more for reading than anything.
That's correct. I mean, fluent in the sense that you are able to read well, you are able to translate. I mean, it does require you know, a certain level of command of the language to be able to translate.
Yeah, and I mean, before that I had Latin and Greek, and I have a little bit of German. And with Apocrypha, I amused myself by writing what do you call them, epigraphs to the book as a whole, in Greek, which I supposedly then translate into English by this imagined Byzantine poet, this woman, Irene Philologos, who was kind of like it felt like writing a novel, because she was like a presence that when she was real, she kind of entered my psyche. It was like I was this woman. So it was very much like I imagine a novelist might feel.
I see.
Yeah, of all the poems that really kind of interested me and kind of enticed my interest. I was like, I really wish I could see the whole work. But so who's
really big? It's
okay.
the length of it's what, 359, 370 odd pages. So it's the length of a novel virtually.
Nice. That's great. So I got one, who is William O'Shaughnessy is number one. But also, like, what's the function of this kind of does the kind of fictive translating play with your other translation work? I mean, is there some sort of dynamic there, or is there?
I think there is, yeah. Well, part of the dynamic is that for me, this fictive translation is almost like translation by another means. So, for example, Gerardo Denis, the Mexican poet, I really loved a long poem of his, but I couldn't get in contact with him. I couldn't get permissions. His Spanish is really hard. There are many people who I wouldn't translate them at all if I couldn't be in contact with them, and have some intermediaries who would pull me up when I don't know what something means, or I'm using what this phrase means in Spain, but it's got a totally different meaning to people in Veracruz or wherever. So it's a sort of way of experimenting with. It's also, often a way of me actually writing about myself, because it's very hard to write things about yourself. So in Ghost Speaking, there's actually there's a woman in there who has polio as a child, and there's a long description. She writes a long section, which kind of brings out things that were sort of my life, but transferred to Cuba and with a invented life. And she has a bad fall later in life and is totally paralyzed or in a wheelchair. And William O'Shaughnessy was very much like who I might have been if my life had gone differently. So he's someone, I didn't, my first book was published when I was 42, and I was writing poetry from when I was 15. So there was a long period of kind of writing a poem that worked every few years and drifting around, being single for a long, long time and alone. And so I give William O'Shaughnessy the tough years of my life.
Yeah.
He's supposedly a Latin and Greek and other things scholar. He also wrote a book that's been disappeared and can't be found anywhere. It's called, what's it called again? Thucydides and/or Chomsky, Athens, Rome, and Washington, and How They Perished.
That could be a real book, I think. The book is somewhere.
It's out there somewhere. So it's kind of, there's a fun element that heteronymous stuff brings out, but also brings out a lot of imaginative, creative stuff. It also brings out this idea of expanding the horizon of Australian poetry or poetry in English to bring in other kinds of voices, other approaches.
Which is really interesting about your poetry. But I never thought that you started that late. Your first book came out past 40. That kind of reminds me of the French poet Francis Ponge. He also started very late. I think his first book came out when he was close to 50. I mean, he's like Jacques Derrida's most favorite poet. There is a saying that there are so many great French poets, but two of the biggest French philosophers, Derrida and Sartre, they both liked Ponge better than anybody else. And Ponge began his poetry career when he was like almost close to 50. So that's really
Mm.
interesting.
Well, Wallace Stevens also began, his first book was published quite late, I think.
Fairly late, yeah, I think. Maybe not
Fairly
yet. Yeah, that's right. That's
Yeah.
right. And for George Joplin, there was a big gap.
Right.
That,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Well, speaking of, it's never too late. So I noticed on your bio that you received your doctorate in just a couple years ago in 2020. What was
Yeah.
it? Doctor of Creative Arts. What's the story behind that? Is what caused you to?
A couple of things happened. The institution where I was working at, like a lot of educational places, was getting more and more unpleasant to be in, as tends to happen around the world.
Right.
And my partner, Debbie, suggested, why don't I apply for a scholarship to do a PhD? I'd already had a master's degree and so on.
Right.
And so I did a ghost speaking and two books translated by Jose Koza. What were they? Tokonoma and not Tokonoma, I don't think. Yeah, no, Caressa de Causa and the other book, Indole of Such a Nature. They were translated at the same time.
Okay.
And I wrote a thing on heteronymous poetry and translation, talking about looking at Pessoa and Edmund Jabez and Juan Hellman's Poemas to Sydney West. So looking at that whole tradition and arguing about the extent to which it does bring in voices from outside of the poetic tradition. So Juan Hellman's book, you've got Brecht and you've got North American poetry, and Pessoa, there is at least one of his brings in Walt Whitman into, brings a kind of really strange, like, what would Walt Whitman be like if you got rid of all his American nationalism and made him a Portuguese poet and just kept the sort of spirit of largeness, expansiveness.
Yeah, so your interest in the heteronymic voices, that I found it really interesting, although we were both a little doubtful as to if these were retranslations or poems written after someone, but now that you mention, I did think of Fernando Pessoa more than anybody else, and also which is something which is related to my personal life and my relationship with two of my co-editors who are much younger than me. They wrote two separate books. They're much younger. One of them was in his 30s when he wrote that. Shubro. He's also bilingual in the sense that he writes in Spanish and also Bengali. And the other co-editor, he wrote a whole book, a heteronymic book about a fictitious Mongolian character. And not related to their efforts, my last book, it's in Bengali, which came out last year. It's about a person who was sort of a Robinson Crusoe theme, was rescued from his boat was capsized and he was rescued, and he had amnesia. He was in a hospital and everything finally came back. Most of the semantic memory came back, but nothing of the episodic memory came. And he was rescued at the island of San Andres, which is close to Colombia. So he had settled down there and he had to take a name. So he took a name of Anom Andres. Anom as in anonymous. So it's a poem about, it's Anom Andres's poems is called Solo Manifestos. So all that came up while I was going through your poetry. It's another interesting connection.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very interesting tradition.
Right.
It's probably much more common in the Latin American Hispanic world than it is in the English-speaking world, but it's quite a big tradition. It's also curious, I don't know why, but it's, I don't know any women who write a heteronymous poem.
That's a very good question.
The male thing, like as if, I guess males no longer think they're interesting enough to write out of
That's
their own
very-
life alone, but need to invent additional lives.
Yeah, that's a very good question.
I don't know whether that's true or not.
Mhm.
I mean, Pessoa was a very unusual case. I mean, he wrote all those heteronymous poetry. He was writing heteronymously from the very beginning as an adolescent teenager. He couldn't really consider any way of writing that didn't get away from himself. It was a kind of barrier of shyness he had to overcome. And he could only do it by continuously inventing things. And also, of course, there's a curiosity that he began writing in English and then later wrote in Portuguese. And, you know, he had this wonderful line to in one of his letters that in order to get published, he would need to win the Nobel Prize first.
So one question I have, let's have you say a few things about Crowded Out, that poem. You know what I noticed there is this unabashed admission of frailty, if I might be allowed to call it, you know, of human survival on the face of the virulence of collaborative power, industry, commerce. So would you like to comment a little bit about Crowded Out, how it came from where it came?
It's a poem that, you know, the poem leaves the author and it's up to whatever resonances people attach to it.
Right.
But I certainly was thinking more of just, there's a whole lot of beings within our single being. So we are a kind of a fragile holding together of a lot of things. That it was, that there is definitely a sense of fragility about it, in the sense when I think of a skeleton holding a wine glass and the child above him watching the trees above him spin in fast motion, which for myself is actually my first memory of life, which is when I was paralyzed and moving from one house to another. And my father borrowed a station wagon to lay me out in the back. And I look up and I see the trees. So it's that moment of seeing trees above me is my first memory in life. And then my father carrying me, I was in a frame, you know, where I could only move my neck. I was in one of those sort of frames for quite some time after the operation. And I got polio when just a month before my 3rd birthday, and I was in hospital for quite a while, and then in and out of hospital for various operations. And I can certainly remember the period when I was totally paralyzed apart from being able to move my neck. So there are memories of immobility that come in to poems or flash here and there, and I'm not necessarily conscious of them.
Yeah, that notion of immobility in a number of poems is palpable. I didn't know the history. Now that you mention it, I can make the connection.
Yeah, I haven't consciously, apart from one poem called Paralysis, I haven't consciously, you know, written about it, but I think it does filter in.
Right.
Yeah.
One thing, given these themes, it's like, I think there are multiple ways that we all can become paralyzed or immobile, you know, whether it be, you know, disease or culture or addiction or grief. It's like, do you have any advice or words of wisdom to those on how to keep moving, I guess, when you're feeling immobile in that way?
No, not really, other than
Yeah,
just
exactly.
to say crying and obvious things. So I mean, I guess that's one of the things about poetry at a kind of conscious level. You don't necessarily have any more wisdom than anybody else.
Right.
It's just poetry to create that.
Well, what keeps you writing? I mean,
well, I mean, I enjoy it. I feel liberated when it happens. It kind of expands the universe. It feels purposive. there's a beauty in it, you know. So to me, poetry, it's like, you know, you're able to create something that's kind of beautiful intrinsically, and you just want to go on doing it as much as you can.
Yeah.
Particularly because you know, the poems only started to come in any kind of fluency from when I was about 38, 39, after I'd married, and around the time that my son was born, when I actually had less time than ever. I had a full-time job, had less time than ever to write, and that was when I started writing more than ever.
Funny
Whereas
how
in
that
all
works.
the years, you know, when would teach in high schools for a couple of years and then head off and travel and supposedly write, but you know, I'd write maybe 1 or 2 poems that worked. 1980, I wrote some translations of Lorca of my own when I lived in Madrid for 6 months, and that was where I first started getting my Spanish.
Okay.
And then years went by and I hadn't done much with it. And then I went into a bookshop, pulled out a novel by Ernesto Sabato, and found that I could pretty much read it.
Oh, great.
Without having done a lot of conscious study. So it's like my psyche, you know, embedded the language and somehow or another worked out how to read it. I mean, after all, those Spanish is really a dialect of Latin with Arabic influence.
Yes, right. Yeah, and so is Italian, which is quite close to Spanish.
Yeah, they're very close. Yeah.
But that's really unique, you know, especially in the Anglophone world. I mean, for us who are from the other side of the world, or in most parts of Europe, people are multilingual naturally. But in the Anglophone world, we don't really see much of that. So it's really quite amazing, I would say, really to be so.
It's very hard to, here in Australia, it's very hard to even use my Spanish, or let alone my French, very much, because the few people that I know that are from Latin America, like a friend from Chile, a friend from Mexico, some people from Peru and El Salvador, they all have far better English than my Spanish. So the conversation naturally just in English. Although my friend in Adelaide, Juan Garrido, he from Chile, when I spent a weekend there, it kicked in because I was staying at his place, and his wife, you know, was speaking Spanish all the time, so the language kicked in.
Okay, that's wonderful. Yeah. Yeah, if you don't have a speaking partner, you know, the language tends to freeze in you.
Well, you know, thank you, Peter, for spending your time with us. Thanks to our virtual listeners, and we appreciate you joining us. And tune in another month or so for the next installment of the MUD Parcel Reading Series.
Thank you, Pat. Thank you, Aryanil.
Thanks.